I think it's safe to say that change is on my agenda. Change for good. And I embrace that and I enjoy that change. I don't fear it. That's the bit that excites me, is the idea of being able to bring some change. Not overly radical change, but changes that I think need to happen.
Breaking, William and Catherine announce shocking decision. Camilla family has been stripped of home. Okay, stay with me, because this title means something far more serious than a royal family disagreement over a house. According to the claims surrounding this story, Prince William and Catherine were presented with legal findings that challenged Camilla's family's long-standing right to remain in a royal-linked residence. And when those findings were reviewed, the issue reportedly came down to one hidden condition inside an older property agreement. The alleged decision was blunt. Camilla's family was said to have lost the right they believed protected their continued occupation of the home. This was not simply about who slept in which bedroom, who had access to the grounds, or who had been welcomed through the doors for years. The dispute reportedly centered on whether years of family understanding could actually stand against the written terms of the original agreement. Now, watch this carefully, because this is where the story becomes difficult to ignore. William and Catherine were reportedly not dealing with a fresh disagreement that appeared overnight. They were allegedly confronted with documents, financial records, and historical property arrangements that raised questions about whether the family's assumed position had ever been as secure as everyone believed. And that distinction matters, because if the reported legal interpretation is correct, then the shocking part is not simply that Camilla's family was stripped of a home. The deeper issue is that the right they thought they had may never have been permanent in the first place. Hi viewers, if you were told for years that a home was yours, only to discover that the paperwork said something completely different, would you fight the decision or accept the documents? Leave a simple yes or no in the comments, because this is exactly where this story begins to turn. The atmosphere surrounding the alleged decision reportedly changed the moment the legal material was placed in front of William and Catherine. There was no need for a dramatic confrontation to make the stakes clear. The documents themselves carried the weight. A historic arrangement was being questioned. A family's expectation was being challenged. And behind those two things stood a much larger question about who actually had the authority to decide what happened to the residents. For years, the assumption surrounding the property had reportedly been treated as settled. That is what made the alleged review so disruptive. When an arrangement survives long enough, people stop asking whether it is legally secure. They simply behave as though it is. Rooms become associated with particular relatives. Future plans begin forming around the property. Money can be spent on improvements. Conversations about renovations can start sounding like conversations about ownership. But a family assumption and a legal right are not necessarily the same thing. That was reportedly the pressure point William and Catherine were forced to confront. The legal review allegedly uncovered inconsistencies between historic property agreements, financial records, and the conditions attached to the family's continued presence. One document appeared to support an established arrangement.
The meeting came sooner than planned. When William came home unexpectedly for the weekend from Eton, Camilla offered to leave, but Charles thought it right that they get it over with.
Another reportedly raised questions about its limits. And somewhere inside that paper trail was the provision that could change the meaning of everything that had happened before. That is the detail that gives this dispute its real force. Because if the hidden condition had been obvious, there would have been no mystery. If everyone had understood the limitation from the beginning, there would have been no years of uncertainty. There would have been no expectation of permanence, no apparent preparation for the future, and no reason for William and Catherine to become involved in the way they reportedly did. The alleged discovery therefore created an uncomfortable possibility. Perhaps the problem was not that somebody suddenly changed the rules. Perhaps the rules had been there all along, while the family operated under a different understanding of what those rules meant. And that would explain why the reaction reportedly became so intense. Camilla's representatives were said to challenge the legal interpretation and demand that the decision be reconsidered. From their perspective, years of established arrangements could not simply disappear because someone had found a different reading of an old agreement. Their position reportedly rested on history, precedent, and the understanding that had developed around the residents over time. But William and Catherine were reportedly being shown something different. They were being shown the written conditions. That difference created the central collision of the entire story. On one side stood years of expectation. On the other stood the alleged legal wording that was now being treated as decisive. And once that question reached the highest levels of the family, the matter could no longer remain a quiet property disagreement. It became a question of authority. Who had promised what? Who had the power to make that promise? Could a private assurance override an older agreement? And if it could not, who had allowed the assumption to continue for so long? Those questions were more dangerous than the announcement itself, because the reported decision did not merely challenge Camilla's family's future relationship with the residents. It potentially forced everyone involved to reconsider the past. Every promise made about the property could now be viewed differently. Every renovation discussion could carry a new meaning. Every financial decision connected to the residents could suddenly become relevant. And William and Catherine allegedly found themselves at the center of that reckoning. The most striking part was that the dispute reportedly did not begin with an explosive accusation. It began with paperwork. That is precisely why the alleged discovery carried so much weight. Paper does not become nervous. Paper does not change its story because someone is angry. Paper simply preserves what was written. And somewhere within those historic records, the lawyers reportedly found the condition that had been overlooked, misunderstood, or left buried for years. By the time the alleged decision was announced, the argument was no longer simply about keeping a family in a home. It was about whether the family had ever possessed the permanent right they believed they had. And that leaves one question hanging over everything that happened next. If that hidden condition was really sitting inside the original agreement all along, who knew about it? Who overlooked it?
Having William by my side is a great source of comfort and reassurance too, as is the love, support and kindness that has been shown by so many of you. It means so much to us both. We hope that you'll understand that as a family, we now need some time, space and privacy.
And why was it allowed to remain buried for so many years? If you believe a powerful family should not be able to hide behind assumptions when the paperwork says otherwise, do not just watch silently. Like this video, share it, and subscribe, because the next part gets worse, when the documents are examined more closely and the reason this old condition survived for so long begins to come into focus. The first sign that the dispute was moving beyond family expectations appeared in the records themselves. A review of the property file reportedly exposed a gap between what Camilla's relatives believed they had been granted and what the historic agreements actually appeared to provide. That gap was not a minor technicality. It went directly to the question of whether their continued occupation could ever become permanent. For years, the family's position had reportedly rested on an established understanding, but none of those assumptions could answer the question now being asked by the lawyers: where, exactly, was the permanent right written down? That question changed the temperature of the dispute. The issue was not whether Camilla's family had been welcomed there. It was not whether they had spent time there. It was not even whether previous members of the family had encouraged them to regard the property as secure. The critical issue was whether those arrangements created a legal interest that could survive a change in circumstances. That distinction reportedly became the focus of the review. Property arrangements can contain several different rights, and the difference between permission to occupy, a limited interest, and permanent ownership can be enormous. A person may be allowed to live somewhere without holding the title. A family may use a residence for years without gaining an unrestricted right to pass it down. An assurance can carry enormous emotional weight while still falling short of a binding legal transfer. That was the uncomfortable territory into which the dispute had reportedly moved. The documents were being examined against the history surrounding the residence. Lawyers were reportedly comparing the language of older agreements with later records and financial activity connected to the property. Each record mattered because it could show what the parties believed had been agreed, what had actually been authorized, and whether those two things were the same. They reportedly were not. One of the most important questions concerned the conditions attached to the original arrangement. If those conditions limited the family's right to remain,
He took her to the flat William had at Clarence House and left them to talk for half an hour. According to Penny Jr., at the end of the conversation, Camilla came out saying, "I need a drink."
then later assumptions could not automatically erase them. If the conditions allowed continued use, but stopped short of permanent entitlement, then years of occupation would not necessarily change the legal position. That possibility put Camilla's relatives in a difficult position. Their argument, as presented in the surrounding claims, was based heavily on history. The arrangement had existed for so long that challenging it now could appear unreasonable. From their perspective, a long-standing understanding should mean something. If a family has planned around a residence, invested in it, and been treated as though it belongs within their future, removing that expectation would feel like a sudden reversal. But the legal review was reportedly asking a colder question. What did the agreement actually say? That question is why the financial records became so important. Spending connected to a property can reveal expectations that words sometimes conceal. Renovation plans, maintenance decisions, professional fees, and other expenses can show whether people were preparing for temporary use or acting as though they expected a lasting position. The reported records allegedly raised enough questions to warrant closer examination. This was not simply about money. It was about intent. If someone spends heavily preparing a residence for long-term use, that can suggest they believe their position is secure. But evidence of intent does not automatically create a legal right. That distinction became another fault line in the dispute. And then came the problem of the assurances. The claims surrounding the story suggest that Camilla's family had received repeated indications that their connection to the residence was safe. Those assurances reportedly helped create the confidence that now stood in direct tension with the lawyer's reading of the paperwork. That created a painful contradiction. If the family had genuinely relied on those assurances, then the alleged decision could feel deeply unfair. But if the assurances went further than the written agreement allowed, then reversing the arrangement could be presented as a correction rather than a betrayal. That was the argument forming beneath the surface. The palace now faced a choice between preserving an established family understanding and enforcing the interpretation emerging from the documents. Neither option was comfortable. Preserving the arrangement could leave unanswered questions about the legal restrictions. Challenging it could create a public family dispute over a residence that had apparently been treated as settled for years. And William and Catherine were reportedly being drawn toward the second path. Their involvement mattered because the issue had moved from private family expectations into a question of formal authority. Once lawyers had identified the alleged inconsistency, ignoring it could create its own problems. A decision-maker who knew of a disputed condition could not pretend it had never been found. That is where the story becomes much more serious. The alleged discovery did not merely threaten Camilla's family's future plans. It placed the entire history of the arrangement under examination. Every assumption had to be separated from every document. Every promise had to be measured against every condition. Every financial decision connected to the residence could be viewed through a different lens. And the longer the review continued, the harder it became to dismiss the matter as a misunderstanding. Then the lawyers reportedly reached the part of the agreement that had been overlooked for years. It was not a new document. It was not a fresh royal order. It was an older condition whose meaning suddenly became decisive. That single provision could determine whether Camilla's family had been protected by the arrangement at all. And if that interpretation held, the question would no longer be whether William and Catherine had gone too far. The question would be why nobody had acted sooner. If you think years of assumptions should never be allowed to defeat the written terms, make your voice count now with a like, a share, and a subscription, because the next part goes directly into the buried condition that could make this entire dispute far more serious. The answer was reportedly sitting in a clause that most people would never have noticed. It was not buried beneath a dramatic headline or highlighted in a separate royal announcement. It was part of the legal wording governing the residence, and according to the claims surrounding the dispute, its significance only became clear when lawyers compared the older agreement with the later arrangements that had grown around it. That was the moment the entire argument reportedly changed. The crucial question was no longer whether Camilla's family had been allowed to stay. The question was whether that permission could legally become something permanent. The distinction sounds simple. Its consequences were not. A residence can be occupied without being owned. A family can be given permission to use a property without receiving the right to pass it to future generations. Even a long-standing arrangement can remain subject to conditions that were written into the original agreement. According to the reported legal review, that distinction was precisely where the problem lay. The original terms allegedly contained a condition limiting what could happen to the residents after the circumstances surrounding the arrangement changed. The condition reportedly did not disappear simply because years had passed or because expectations had grown around it. And that meant the family's confidence in the property could not, by itself, settle the legal question. The lawyers reportedly began comparing the original wording with later financial records. They were looking for evidence that could establish whether the residents had been treated in a way the original agreement actually permitted. That comparison allegedly produced another uncomfortable discovery. The financial trail reportedly suggested that decisions had been made with the expectation of continued family access. Money had been committed. Plans had been discussed. The property had been treated as though its future was already understood. But the paperwork allegedly told a narrower story. The residence could be used under certain conditions. That did not necessarily mean it could become a permanent family possession. This distinction became the pressure point. If the family had acted on assurances that went beyond the written agreement, then the dispute was no longer simply about ownership. It was about whether years of expectations had been built on an interpretation that the legal documents could not support. That is a much more damaging question, because it creates two competing versions of the same history. In one version, Camilla's relatives had every reason to believe the residence was secure. They had been surrounded by an established arrangement and had reportedly made decisions based upon it. In the other version, the arrangement had always contained limits, and those limits were simply not being enforced in the way the lawyers now believed they should be. Neither interpretation could comfortably coexist. The next issue was even more important. Who had authority to change the arrangement? If the original agreement contained restrictions, could later assurances override them? Could a private promise alter a condition that had been formally established? Could family understanding carry greater weight than the legal mechanism governing the property? The reported legal analysis suggested that the answer was not straightforward, and that uncertainty created the opening for the confrontation that followed. William and Catherine were reportedly presented with the findings because the dispute had reached a point where someone had to decide whether the old conditions still mattered. They did. That decision would have consequences beyond the residence itself. If the condition was enforced, Camilla's family's expected future at the property could collapse. If it was ignored, the old agreement could become little more than historical paperwork, while later assumptions effectively replaced it. That was the choice facing the decision-makers. The most revealing detail was that the alleged restriction did not appear to target Camilla personally. It concerned the legal status of the property and the rights created by the original arrangement. That distinction matters. It meant the dispute could be presented as a legal issue rather than a personal attack. But inside a family as closely watched as the royal family, separating law from emotion was never going to be easy. Camilla's representatives reportedly argued that the family's long-standing connection to the residence had to be considered. The opposing interpretation focused on the written conditions. The two sides were now arguing from completely different foundations. One relied on history, the other relied on the document. Then came the detail that reportedly made the situation impossible to dismiss. The alleged condition had implications for the future, not merely the present. If it restricted permanent rights, then the family's plans for continued occupation could not simply be treated as a matter of custom. Any arrangement extending beyond the permitted period could potentially require additional authority. That raised another question. Had anyone attempted to create a new arrangement that would effectively achieve what the original agreement had restricted? The answer, according to the claims surrounding the story, was one of the reasons the review became so serious. There were reportedly proposals and discussions concerning ways the family could continue using the residence without formally taking ownership. On paper, such an arrangement might appear different from permanent possession, but legally, the distinction could depend on the exact terms. A long arrangement can sometimes create many of the practical benefits of ownership without transferring formal title. That is why the lawyers reportedly examined the proposals so closely. The issue was no longer simply what the family wanted. It was whether the proposed solution could legally achieve that result. And this is where the hidden condition allegedly became the real obstacle. The provision had effectively placed a boundary around the property. Crossing that boundary would require more than a family agreement. It would require the authority specified by the governing arrangement. That revelation reportedly left the palace facing a problem that could not be solved with a quiet promise. The documents had created a standard that personal assurances could not easily overcome. And suddenly, the announcement in the title looked very different. William and Catherine were not simply deciding whether Camilla's family should remain in a home. They were allegedly being asked to decide whether an old legal restriction should finally be enforced. That is why the next move mattered so much. Because once the hidden condition had been identified, there was no longer an easy way back to the comfortable assumption that the residence was simply part of the family's future. The paperwork had changed the question, and the next confrontation would reveal whether Camilla's side could challenge the interpretation before the alleged decision became final. If you have stayed this far, do not look away now. Like, share, and subscribe if you believe hidden conditions should be confronted instead of ignored, because the next chapter takes this from a disputed document to the moment William and Catherine reportedly make the decision that changes everything. The decision was no longer theoretical. William and Catherine reportedly had the legal findings in front of them, and the question was now whether the disputed right would be recognized or rejected. What happened next would determine whether Camilla's family could continue treating the residence as part of its future. The response from Camilla's side was immediate. Representatives reportedly challenged the interpretation and pushed for reconsideration. Their position was that years of established arrangements could not simply be brushed aside because lawyers had reached a different conclusion about an old provision. That argument placed the palace in a difficult position. Rejecting the family's position could create a family confrontation. Accepting it could leave the newly examined legal condition effectively unenforced. Either choice carried consequences. William and Catherine reportedly focused on the written terms. That became the dividing line. The answer, according to the claims surrounding the story, was no. the reported decision moved beyond discussion and into action. Camilla's representatives were said to have argued that the arrangement should be preserved, or at minimum, that the family should be allowed to remain under a revised agreement. That proposal would have given everyone a way out. The family could keep its connection to the property, while the palace could avoid the appearance of abruptly removing relatives from a place they had regarded as secure. But the legal problem remained. A revised arrangement could not simply erase the original conditions if those conditions required a particular form of approval. That point reportedly became decisive. William and Catherine were allegedly unwilling to treat a new promise as a substitute for the authority required by the original agreement. If the property was governed by conditions that had survived for years, then any new arrangement would have to respect those conditions. This was where the dispute reportedly became personal. For Camilla's family, the issue could look like a rejection of years of trust. For William and Catherine, the issue could be presented as a responsibility to enforce the rules governing the residence. The disagreement was already complete. Then came the question that reportedly unsettled everyone involved. If Camilla's family could not claim the permanent right they had expected, what would happen to the residents next? That question exposed the larger significance of the decision. The property could not simply remain in limbo forever. Someone would have to determine who could occupy it, under what conditions, and with what authority. And that meant the alleged decision against Camilla's family was only the first consequence. The next step concerned control. William's position reportedly mattered because the review had placed him in the uncomfortable role of enforcing a framework that affected his own family. Catherine's involvement added another layer, because the decision could not easily be dismissed as a technical matter handled by lawyers behind closed doors. Together, they represented a change in direction. The family was no longer relying only on private assurances. The documents had become the reference point. The palace could no longer pretend the dispute was merely personal. Camilla's representatives reportedly pressed for reconsideration, but the alleged decision moved forward. The family's claimed right to the home was stripped away, not because a new ownership arrangement had suddenly appeared, but because the old legal basis for their continued claim was reportedly judged insufficient. That distinction mattered. It meant the announcement was not simply a declaration that William and Catherine preferred someone else to occupy the residence. It was a rejection of the claim itself. The reported ruling also created an uncomfortable question for those who had supported the previous understanding. If the family's permanent right was never established, why had the arrangement been treated as though it were settled? That question had no easy answer. It could point toward misunderstanding. It could point toward incomplete legal advice. It could point toward assurances that were broader than the documents allowed. Or it could simply reflect years of assumptions becoming stronger each time nobody challenged them. Whatever the explanation, the result was the same. The family now faced the loss of an expected future at the residence, and the palace faced the consequences of making that decision visible. A private disagreement could have been contained. A formal decision carried a different weight. It told everyone connected to the property that the old assumption could no longer be treated as automatic. The residents would be governed according to the terms being relied upon in the legal review, rather than according to years of family expectation. But there was still one problem. Removing one family's claimed right did not answer the question of what should replace it. The residence still existed. The legal framework still existed. And whoever came next would inherit not merely a property, but the controversy surrounding it. That was the point at which the dispute reportedly became bigger than the original announcement. Because the real question was no longer who had lost the home. It was who would ultimately control what happened to it. And that question was about to produce the most unexpected consequence of the entire dispute. If you believe a decision this serious should be followed all the way to its final consequence, do not stop here. Like this video, share it and subscribe, because the next chapter reveals what reportedly happened after Camilla's family lost its claimed right, and why the aftermath became even more uncomfortable for the royal family. The residence was now the center of a very different question. What would happen after Camilla's family lost the right they had expected to keep? According to the claims surrounding the dispute, the answer was not simply to hand the property to another relative and move on. The alleged decision created a responsibility to determine what the residence was actually supposed to represent, and who should control its future under the terms being relied upon. That changed the meaning of the announcement. William and Catherine had reportedly challenged the family's claim, but the consequences reached further. A residence tied to years of family expectations could not simply return to normal after a decision of this kind. The people who had regarded it as part of their future now had to confront a different reality. For years, the family's position had reportedly felt secure because the arrangement had been treated as established. Now that assumption had been rejected. The question was no longer what everyone had believed, it was what could actually be defended. If the residence could not remain under the arrangement Camilla's family had expected, then every future proposal would have to pass the same legal test. A new promise could not simply recreate the old assumption. Any continued use would have to fit within the authority and restrictions attached to the property. Camilla's representatives were said to have challenged the decision and sought reconsideration. But the legal issue could not be solved by emotion alone. The family's history with the residence might explain their expectations, yet history could not automatically create a right that the governing agreement did not provide. That left both sides facing an uncomfortable conclusion. One side had lost an expected home. The other had inherited responsibility for explaining why that home could no longer be treated as theirs. And the public question became unavoidable. Was this really a sudden act by William and Catherine, or was it the consequence of an old restriction finally being taken seriously? The distinction matters because the first interpretation makes the decision look like a family power struggle. The second makes it look like an enforcement of rules that had been overlooked for years. The claims establish the central tension. A family's long-standing expectation collided with a legal interpretation that reportedly challenged the foundation of that expectation. And that collision explains why the dispute became so emotionally charged. A home is never only bricks, rooms, and land when generations have built memories around it. Losing access can feel like losing a piece of family history. But a legal agreement does not measure history in the same way people do. It measures rights. That was the lesson at the heart of the alleged decision. The residence had become a test of whether long-standing assumptions could survive when the original terms were finally examined with fresh scrutiny. And the consequences did not end with Camilla's family. The dispute reportedly raised a broader issue for the royal household. How many other arrangements might be based more heavily on family understanding than on clearly enforceable rights? That question could prove more uncomfortable than the property itself. Because once one old agreement is reopened, other documents can attract attention. Once one assumption is challenged, other assumptions can be questioned. And once lawyers begin examining the difference between what was promised and what was legally granted, the boundary between private family business and institutional responsibility becomes much harder to maintain. The final consequence was therefore larger than the disputed residence itself. It forced attention onto the rules behind royal property, the promises surrounding them, and the people responsible for interpreting those rules when expectations and written terms collided. That is why the alleged outcome carries significance beyond one residence. William and Catherine's reported decision placed the written terms at the center of the dispute. Camilla's family, meanwhile, was left facing the consequences of an arrangement they had apparently believed would protect their future. The most striking question remains the simplest one. If the hidden condition really was decisive, why did it take so long for its meaning to become the focus of a dispute? That question reaches back through the entire story. It reaches into the original agreement. It reaches into the assurances that reportedly followed. It reaches into the decisions made around the residents. And it reaches directly to the people who may have understood the arrangement differently from one another. The title promised a shocking decision, but the deeper story is about something more unsettling, the possibility that everyone involved had been living with different ideas about what the same property arrangement actually meant. That is why this alleged dispute matters. It is not simply about who gets a home. It is about what happens when years of trust collide with a document that says something else. And if the reported legal interpretation stands, the residents may become a lasting reminder that royal family arrangements can look settled for years until someone finally asks the one question nobody wants to answer. Who actually had the right to decide? Before leaving this story behind, remember the question at its center. If you believe powerful families should be held to the same written rules they expect everyone else to respect, then do not let this story disappear quietly. Like the video, share it with someone who follows royal affairs, subscribe to this channel, and turn on notifications, because staying silent changes nothing, while your support helps keep difficult questions in the open. And stay with this channel, because the next video is about to take another royal controversy even further, and what comes next could be far more revealing than this dispute ever was.